Fire away.
Should we start?
Yeah, just go ahead.
Do you believe the death penalty is morally correct? Is it fair punishment for the crimes that have been committed?
Well, there's two different questions. Do I believe it's a morally appropriate punishment?
Yeah.
And the answer is no, I don't believe the state has the right to kill. There's a whole host of philosophical reasons, but I can just start with the practical ones, if you want me to go through those. I don't know how much time you guys have.
We just need like one or two.
Okay. Okay, well, putting aside moral opposition, let's just talk about the practical consequences of the death penalty. What we see when you look at the population of death row around the country, is you see it's generally populated by people that are poor and people of color. The death penalty is supposed to be for the worst of the worst, but what it's really for is the poorest of the poor and the people with the worst legal representation. So it's not like a similar murder in two different jurisdictions. The person will always receive death. The person will receive death if he has the worst lawyer. And that's just not right. It's not right to mete out the death penalty only to those poor among us and those who are black or Hispanic. And that's what we see happening in death rows around the country. And more often than not, the death penalty is reserved for those who kill whites rather than those who kill people of color. So there's an extraordinary racism involved in the death penalty. We could go on, but I suspect you have limited time and limited footage in your camera.
That actually,
questions.
that goes into like our second question though.
Okay, fire away.
Do you see biased juries during cases based on the defendant's race?
I don't see biased juries and I don't see biased prosecutions. What you see when you look at the statistics is that the greatest correlation as to whether someone's going to get on death row is a combination of the race of the defendant and the race of the victim. And a lot of people are unaware. If it's a white victim and let's say a black defendant, that's your highest probability of putting that person on death row. Now, I don't think that means that juries are racist or prosecutors are racist, because there's a lot of places decisions are made in the system. A prosecutor has to decide to charge this capitally. A jury has to decide to come back with a murder conviction. A jury has to then decide to impose death. I don't think that overt racism is really a huge factor, but there's subconscious racism that explains the sharp disparity in the population of death row, and the victim-defendant combination is extremely troubling.
Okay. Economically, do you think the death penalty is efficient?
Oh, it's a disastrous waste of money. And I say this as a death penalty lawyer that benefits from that waste of money. When I get paid, not a great deal, but I get paid to represent guys on death row, and it is a colossal waste of money. It takes probably between 15 and 25 years after someone's convicted to execute them, at least in California, at a cost of millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. Probably $138 million a year now in the death penalty system. And we probably executed 10 guys in the last 15 years.
Okay.
If you have life without parole, it's a hell of a lot cheaper.
Well,
It's counterintuitive that life without parole would be cheaper.
Yeah.
But the cost spent in legal fees and court costs and experts and witnesses and proceedings, rather than the money spent each year just to keep someone incarcerated, it's an enormous difference.
Okay. Let's just skip that. Do you think the threat of the death penalty reduces crime rate?
Deterrence. I don't think so. I realize there's legitimate dispute on this, and you guys may know this, or you should know it. There's a lot of studies as to whether the death penalty is a deterrent. And basically, the experts do double regression statistical analysis, and what they come up with is there's no way to tell. If you look at neighboring states with similar demographics, you will see that those states without the death penalty have lower murder rates. That doesn't mean necessarily it's not a deterrent, but what it means is that you certainly can't prove that it is a deterrent.
Do you think the death penalty should be reserved only for murder, exclusively for murder cases, or for crimes like treason or kidnapping? Well,
in this country, it's reserved for murder cases. That has been developed through years of litigation in the United States Supreme Court. They have reserved it for murder cases. There might be some special federal statutes that say attempted murder of the president, for example, might be a capital offense. As to whether I think that's the right rule, I do think it's the right rule. I mean, 40 or 50 years ago, you could get the death penalty for rape, you could get the death penalty for robbery, and what we saw, especially in southern states, is that there was an extraordinary use of statistically significant racism involved in those kind of death penalties. In other words, blacks that were convicted of rape were getting death. Whites that were convicted of rape were getting 1 or 2 or 3 years in prison. So I think limiting it to homicides and murders in particular has cut down on that problem a bit.
Okay, do you remember the ones on the website anymore? Because these are pretty repetitive.
Okay. Can you give us like a brief history of the death penalty? Like,
a brief history of the death penalty?
Or like the multiple ways it has been seen throughout history.
Yeah.
Well, I'm certainly no expert on the death penalty throughout history. I can give you a brief history of the death penalty in this country. I mean, it's been on the books in most states since we've been a country. Not all the states have the death penalty. Right now, as of last week, when Maryland abolished the death penalty, we now, I think, have 18 states without the death penalty. And the District of Columbia doesn't have it either. In the 60s, almost all the states had it. And there was a concerted effort, an abolition movement, to abolish the death penalty that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court and resulted in some success in the early 70s in a case called Furman versus Georgia. All the death penalty statutes were struck down. And the thought in the death penalty community was that that would be the end of it. But they weren't politically savvy enough to realize that there would be a backlash, and there was, and probably 40 states or 38 states reenacted death penalty statutes immediately after the Supreme Court struck them down. And since then, it's been a battle state by state to get additional states to abolish and to fight the death penalty in court. So that's your thumbnail description, at least since the 60s.
Okay. Do you know how long lethal injection has been the, I guess, formal way?
The preferred method of execution?
Yeah.
Well, let's back up a minute. It isn't the preferred method of execution in every state. California originally had the hanging, then they had the electric chair, then they had the gas chamber, and now we have lethal injection. It's probably been around maybe 10 years or so, maybe a little longer. Robert Alton Harris, which was the first person executed in California since that 1972 decision by the U.S. Supreme Court that struck down all the statutes, he was, and the first few executions after that were in the gas chamber. So it's been since then, and that was in the late 80s, early 90s. So lethal injection's probably been around, 15 years.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
We're done? Good.
That was easy.